You're tuned into the podcast Sentimental Journey, where discussions happen on the music of the World War II era. My name is Hollis Zimmerman, and I will be exploring this important time in music history. Hello, and welcome to Sentimental Journey. Today we are going to briefly review the male crooners of the World War II era with a special focus on Bing Crosby, Louis Armstrong, and Frank Sinatra. Well, let me tell you, the 1940s is when Europe was in conflict and the United States government was preparing for a possible war. Military funding increased and the Selective Service Draft went into effect in September of 1940. Then after the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, the United States entered World War II. As American servicemen began to leave for distant shores, the songs of the male crooners added to the soundtrack for World War II and made an impact on the war efforts. By 1940, 80% of American households who would own a radio, making American music more accessible to civilians and soldiers alike. Unlike many World War I songs, World War II songs focused more on romance and strength instead of propaganda, morale, and patriotism. Songs that were overly patriotic or militaristic were often rejected by the public. During World War II, American music helped to inspire servicemen and people working in the war industries. Popular male entertainers of the era included Frank Sinatra, Bob Hope, Bing Crosby, Al Jolson, Irving Berlin, Fred Astaire, Johnny Mercer, Dick Haymes, Bob Everly, Vaughn Monroe, Dooley Wilson, and George Formby. In 1941, the United States Service Organizations, also known as the USO, were established just prior to the U.S. entry into World War II. Many of music's top names and entertainers contributed to the war effort by offering performances for the military and their families through USO performances. Some of the regular performers included Bing Crosby, Fred Astaire, Frank Sinatra, Al Jolson, Irving Berlin, and of course Bob Hope, who would be the face of USO. Well, let me tell you what a crooner is. A crooner is a term used to describe primarily male singers who performed using a smooth style made possible by better microphones, which picked up quieter sounds and a wide range of frequencies, allowing the singer to utilize more dynamic range and perform in a more intimate manner. The crooning style, developed out of singers who performed with the big bands, reached its height in the 1940s. Crooning was epitomized by Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra. The microphone was key to being a crooner. It allowed singers to use a nuanced vocal palette and remain audible while singing softly. Many perceive this sort of singing, labeled crooning, as intimate and romantic. Well, let me tell you, the first musician I'm going to highlight is Bing Crosby. He was a musician who made a tremendous impact in the World War II era. He was one of the prominent male crooners and multimedia entertainer of the 1940s. His career lasted from 1926 until his death in 1977. He was born Harry Lillis Crosby. As a child, he was a fan of a humorous newspaper column called Bingleville Bugle. He got his nickname Bing from an older neighbor boy who shared Bing Crosby's enthusiasm for the Bugle and began calling Crosby Bingo from Bingville. The last vowel was later dropped and the name shortened to Bing, which struck. Crosby was born on May 3, 1903 in Tacoma, Washington, in a house that his father built, 1112 North J Street. In the fall of 1920, Bing enrolled in Gonzaga College in Spokane, Washington, with the intent to become a lawyer. While in Gonzaga, he sent away for a set of mail-order drums. He was soon invited to join a local band made up mostly of high school students called Musicalators. Crosby made enough money doing this that he decided to drop out of school during his final year to pursue a career in show business. In 1926, while working at Los Angeles Metropolitan Theater, Crosby caught the eye of Paul Whiteman, one of the most famous band leaders at that time. Hired for $150 a week, he and his singing partner Al Winkler, whom he had worked with since his Spokane days, made their debut on September 6, 1926, at the Tivoli Theater in Chicago. Crosby soon became the star attraction of the Rhythm Boys, and in 1928 he had his first #1 hit, a jazz-influenced rendition of Old Man River. However, with growing dissatisfaction with the Whiteman, caused him and the other Rhythm Boys to leave the band and join the Gus Arheim Orchestra. Around that time, Crosby made his solo debut on the radio with the Carl Fenton Orchestra on a popular CBS radio show. As the 1930s unfolded, Crosby rose to the top of the ranks of American vocal artists. 10 of the top 50 songs for 1931 featured either him or solo with others. He signed long-term deals with Jack Kapp's new record company, Decca, and starred in his first full-length film feature, The Big Broadcast, 1932. By 1936, he had replaced his former boss, Paul Whiteman, as host of NBC's Kraft Music Hall, which was a radio program where he remained for the next 10 years. Where the Blue of the Night meets the Gold of the Day with his trademark whistling became his theme song and signature tune. After having the biggest hit of 1936, Bing Crosby followed it up with one of the biggest one of 1937 just months later, Sweet Leilani from the Hawaiian theme film Waikiki Wedding. He showed Bing the direction his career could take over in the course of the 1940s. Though he had recorded several cowboy songs earlier in the 1930s, as well as the occasional song of inspiration, Crosby began covering everything under the sun, popular hits of every genre of contemporary music. These weren't cast-offs either. Many of his 1940 country and western covers were hits, such as the new San Antonio Rose, You Are My Sunshine, and Deep in the Heart of Texas. In the wake of a solid decade of headlining many smash hit comedy musical films in the 1930s, Crosby starred with Dorothy Lamour in 6 of 7 road to musical comedies between 1940 and 1962. Crosby's biggest musical hit was his recording of Irving Berlin's White Christmas, which he introduced through a 1941 Christmas season radio broadcast and the film Holiday Inn. The recording hit the charts on October 3, 1942, and raised to number 1 on October 31st, where it stayed for 11 weeks. It was a favorite for soldiers on the various USO tours Crosby attended during the war years, as was another holiday song, I'll Be Home for Christmas. Crosby's popular success continued after the end of the war, and he remained the top box office draw until 1948. After Bing recorded White Christmas, he joined Hollywood Victory Caravan, a traveling show to raise money for war bonds. Bing Crosby's sales and chart statistics placed him among the most popular and successful music acts of the 20th century. Although the Billboard charts operated into a different methodology for the bulk of Crosby's career, his numbers remained astonishing. 2,000 recordings, 383 of them in the top 30, and of those, 42 hit number 1. Crosby had separate charting singles in every calendar year between 1931 and 1954. With the advent of the American involvement in World War II, Bing Crosby entered the peak of his career. Arriving in 1940 was the first of his popular road movies with his friend Bob Hope and Dorothy Lamour, along with 3 of the biggest hits of that year. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the House and the Senate required that all men in the age range of 20 to 44 years inclusive register for the draft, and Crosby, who was age 38 at the time, joined the priority list for being drafted. Crosby wanted to do as much as possible for the war effort pending being drafted, but it soon became evident that he was unlikely to be conscripted because of his age and his family. It doesn't seem that he was very embarrassed not at being called up, and evidently decided that he could do more to help the war effort by entertaining and boosting war bond sales than in being in uniform. Crosby's embarrassment about his absence from the armed forces ended on December 5, 1942, when the War Department suspended induction of men of 38 years of age or older. Crosby entertained American GIs while touring with the USO. On January 29, 1942, in response to a request from General MacArthur on the behalf of his soldiers, Crosby sent his Kraft Hall radio show by shortwave to the American forces. He dedicated the opening song, The Caissons Go Rolling Along, to the Philippine defenders. The War Department subsequently established the Armed Forces radio service on May 26, 1942 to keep American forces informed and entertained, and Crosby was quick to become involved. Within days, he recorded his first guest shot at a command performance show. The Command Performance Series was recorded weekly on transcription disc for shipment to overseas forces instead of being recorded weekly on transcription disc to overseas forces instead of being broadcast live, and Crosby's experience of recording for radio in this way was a way to have a major impact on the show business activities after the war when he pushed hard to allow to record his shows. This led to a break with his long-running Kraft Music Hall show and a switch to Philco Radio Time. Armed Forces radio service shows Crosby participated in during wartime between December 7, 1941 and August 15, 1945 totaled more than 70 appearances, including Command Performance, which was 30 appearances, and Mail Call with 13 appearances, GI Journal 19 appearances, Song Sheet at least 5 appearances, Personal Album many appearances, Frontline Theater, and Jubilee at least twice. In the 8 months of the war, Crosby made 8 full-length albums, 12 short films including guest appearances, appeared in at least 90 other radio programs, recorded 160 songs for commercial release, and out of those, an incredible 54 were top 30 hits, including 9 which reached number 1. In addition, his songs White Christmas and Swinging on a Star won the Oscar for Best Film Song in their respective years. Recorded. In all, Crosby spent 25 weeks touring to entertain servicemen without adding numerous weekend trips. His fundraising activities resulted in the sales of millions of dollars of war bonds, and he raised substantial amounts for the USO, Red Cross, and other charities. Well, next I'm going to introduce Louis Armstrong, who's also another male crooner, one of the male entertainers, an influential jazz vocalist and trumpeter, and his music and career made an impact on the World War II era, sending much of his music to soldiers overseas. Armstrong was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana on August 4, 1901. Coming to prominence in the 1920s as an inventive trumpet and cornet player, Armstrong was a foundational influence in jazz. Around 1922, he followed his mentor, Joe King Oliver, to Chicago to play in the Creole Jazz Band. In Chicago, he spent many other times with popular jazz musicians, reconnecting them with his friend Bix Beiderbecke and spending time with Hoagy Carmichael and Lil Hardin. He earned a reputation at Cutting Contests, which was an improvisational music contest among jazz musicians, and his fame reached band leader Fletcher Henderson. In 1925, Armstrong returned to Chicago largely in sense of Lil Hardin, who wanted to expand his career and income. In publicity, much of his chagrin, who billed him as the world's greatest trumpet player. For a time, he was a member of Lil Hardin's Armstrong Band. He later formed Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five. Armstrong also played with Erskine's Tate Little Symphony, which played mostly at the Vendome Theater. They furnished music for silent movies and shows, including jazz versions of classical music such as Madame Butterfly, which gave Armstrong experience with larger forms of music and performing before a large audience. He began to scat sing, improvised vocal jazz using nonsensical words, and was among the first to record it. Armstrong returned to New York in 1929, where he played in the pit orchestra for the musical Hot Chocolates, an all-black revue written by Andy Razaf and pianist Fats Waller. He made a cameo appearance as a vocalist, regularly stealing the show with his rendition of Ain't Misbehavin'. His version of the song became the biggest selling record to date. As with the trumpet playing, Armstrong's vocal innovation served as a foundation stone for the art of jazz vocal interpretation. His scat singing style was enriched by the matchless experience as a trumpet soloist. During the 1920s, Louis Armstrong brought a huge impact during the Harlem Renaissance within the jazz world. Working with his mentor King Oliver in Chicago, Armstrong explored and expanded the sounds of his native New Orleans. By the early 1930s, Armstrong had displayed unprecedented virtuosity, sculpting the jazz solo into a unique art form and invigorated the jazz world with a new rhythmic vision of swing. In 1936, Armstrong's career was on the rise again. He performed regularly on a sponsored radio show and appeared in the movie Pennies from Heaven with Bing Crosby and released a new autobiography. Before long, he signed a recording contract with Decca Records and cut a new hit single, Swing That Music. music. Many of Armstrong's Decca recordings were commercial hits enjoyed by the public and lauded by his fellow musicians. At the same time, his appearances in movies made him an international superstar. During the next 30 years, Armstrong played more than 300 performances a year. Booking for big bands tapered off in the 1940s due to changes in public taste. Ballrooms closed and there were competition from television and other types of music becoming more popular than big band music. It became impossible under such circumstances to finance a 16-piece touring band. During the 1940s, a widespread revival of interest in the traditional jazz of the 1920s made it possible for Armstrong to consider a return to the small group musical style of his youth. Armstrong was featured as a guest artist with Lionel Hampton's band, name of the second cavalcade of jazz concert held at Wrigley Field in Los Angeles. During the height of World War II, the American Federation of Musicians declared a recording strike to much irritation of the president and government. The strike lasted for years, with many suggesting that musicians were aiding the war effort. Happily, however, many recordings have survived the form of radio broadcast transcriptions and discs earmarked for distribution to the GIs overseas. His personal fulfillment fortified Louis against new challenges. The Musicians Union recording ban of 1942, coupled the advent of World War II, prevented Armstrong from recording frequently, but he still managed to leverage his talent to help the war effort. He performed for the troops over the Armed Forces Radio Service and recorded on V-disc, highly durable records distributed to military personnel. Shortly after World War II, Louis co-starred with vocalist Billie Holiday in the film New Orleans. Though the movie was not a hit, it would go down as a career highlight for both great singers, and Holiday cited Armstrong as one of her chief influences. Louis Armstrong reinvented himself one more time. With big bands in decline, his brilliant appearances at New York Town Hall in 1947 gave birth to the small ensemble called the Louis Armstrong All-Stars, and he's remembered as one of jazz's all-time greatest artists. Finally, now I'm going to focus on one of the great easy listening crooners of the 1940s, Mr. Frank Sinatra. Though Frank Sinatra was not involved in combat during World War II, his music and legacy is remembered at the height of the 1940s. He began his career during the big band era as a well-known backing singer with Tommy Dorsey's orchestra. He remained a popular male vocalist during and after World War II. Frank Sinatra was born to Italian immigrants in Hoboken, New Jersey. Sinatra found success as a solo artist after he signed with Columbia Records in 1943. He got his first big break in 1935 when his mother persuaded him to join a local singing group called the Three Flashes. His musical influences were Rudy Vallee and his idol Bing Crosby. After dropping out of high school, he began to sing at obscure clubs. He got his first big break with Major Bowles in his amateur hour in 1935, singing in a group called the Hoboken Four. Sinatra got his first radio play in 1939 on station WNEW in New York City. Then he signed with his first band leader, Harry James, for $75 per week. In June, band leader Harry James, who had heard Sinatra sing on Dance Parade, signed a 2-year contract of $75 a week one evening after a show at the Paramount Theater in New York. In November 1939, Frank Sinatra left Harry James to replace Jack Leonard as the singer of the Tommy Dorsey Band. With Dorsey, Sinatra earned $125 a week appearing at the Palmer House in Chicago, and James released Sinatra from his contract. On January 26, 1940, he made his first public appearance with the band at the Coronado Theater in Rockford, Illinois, opening the show with Stardust. In his first year with Dorsey, Sinatra recorded over 40 songs. Sinatra's first vocal hit was the song Polka Dots and Moonbeams in late April 1940. 2 more chart appearances followed with Say It and Imagination, which was Sinatra's first top 10 hit. His 4th chart appearance was I'll Never Smile Again, topping the chart for 12 weeks beginning in mid-July. Other records with Tommy Dorsey issued by RCA Victor included Our Love Affair and Stardust in 1940. Other records with Tommy Dorsey issued by RCA Victor include Our Love Affair and Stardust in 1940, Oh Look at Me Now, and This Love of Mine in 1941, Just As You Were There, and These Are Such Things in 1942. By May of 1941, Sinatra's appeal to the Bobby Soxers, as teenage girls at that time were called, revealed a whole new audience for popular music, which had been recorded mainly for adults up to that time. That phenomenon became known as Sinatra Mania after his legendary opening for 4 weeks after his legendary opening at the Paramount Theater in New York on December 30th, 1942. Sinatra performed 4 weeks at the theater, his act followed by the Benny Goodman Orchestra, after which his contract was renewed for another 4 weeks by Bob Whiteman due to his popularity. Some 1,000 Sinatra fan clubs cropped up in the U.S. When Sinatra returned to the Paramount in October 1944, only 250 persons could attend. The 3,500 fans were left outside and caused a near riot because they were not allowed in. Sinatra signed with Columbia Records as a solo artist on June 1st, 1943, during the 1942-1944 musicians' strike. During the 1942 to 1944 musicians' strike, Columbia Records re-released Harry James and Sinatra's August 1939 version of All or Nothing at All, which reached number 2 on June 2nd, was on the best-selling list for 18 weeks. He initially had great success, performed on the radio on Your Hit Parade from February of 1943 until December 1944. Of 9 of his songs recorded, 7 charted on the best-selling list. Sinatra released You'll Never Know, Close to You, Sunday, Monday, or Always as singles, and Sunday, Monday, or Always as singles. Sinatra did not serve in the military during World War II. After several film appearances, he had the largest role to date, co-starring with Gene Kelly in the 1945 musical Anchors Aweigh. In 1945, he released his first album, The Voice of Frank Sinatra. He also debuted in a weekly radio series. On December 11, 1943, he was officially classified as 4F, Registrant Not Acceptable for Military Service. Officially classified 4F by his draft board because of a perforated eardrum. However, U.S. Army files reported that Sinatra was not acceptable material from a psychiatric viewpoint, but his emotional instability was hidden to avoid undue unpleasantness for both the selectee and the induction service. Briefly, there were rumors reported by columnist Walter Winchell that Sinatra paid $40,000 to avoid the service. Sinatra worked frequently with the popular Andrews Sisters in radio in the 1940s, and many USO shows were broadcast to troops via the Armed Forces radio service. Sinatra went to war but portrayed the war as a soldier and GIs in his movies. He was classified as a 4F that wasn't acceptable for the armed forces due to a ruptured eardrum. He spent the war years entertaining the troops with several successful overseas tours with comedian Phil Silvers. Despite being heavily involved in political activity in 1945 and 1946, Sinatra sang on 160 radio shows, recorded 36 times, and shot 4 films. By 1946, he was performing on stage up to 45 times a week, singing up to 100 songs daily, and earning up to $93,000 a week. He also signed with Capitol Records and began a successful partnership, introducing many of his swinging songs, such as Come Fly With Me. Nelson Riddle helped Sinatra stay on the competitive record charts throughout the rest of the decade. In fact, Sinatra stayed on the charts steadily through 1967. Sinatra could surround a central theme with a large collection of songs or ballads. His career began to stall until 1953 when he won Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in From Here to Eternity. The following year, he starred alongside Bing Crosby and Grace Kelly in High Society. Sinatra worked with a group of entertainers in the Las Vegas casino shows, and the men became good friends. These men included Dean Martin, Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, and Sammy Davis Jr. They would eventually become known as the Rat Pack. Sinatra continued to appear in films until 1968. Afterward, he only appeared in a handful of TV and movie appearances over the years. And in 1969, he released his biggest song, My Way. Well, today we've examined some of the important male crooners, including Bing Crosby, Louis Armstrong, and Frank Sinatra, who made an impact during the World War II era, and talked about what they did to support the war and spoke about their successful music careers. Well, you can find us on Facebook at Sentimental Journey, so be sure to subscribe to our podcast. Thanks so much for joining us.